summer camp was the kind of place where memories were made. Campfires, ghost stories, swimming in the lake. It was nestled deep within the forest, a good distance from any town or city. The camp had been around for decades, and every year, kids from all over would come to spend their summer under the watchful eyes of the counselors. But there was one part of the camp that everyone avoided: the old, abandoned cabin at the edge of the woods. Camp Wainwright had its fair share of legends, but the most persistent was about the cabin. Built over a century ago, it had once housed the camp's original founders. As the story went, the couple who built the cabin lived there alone, isolated from the rest of the world. They were kind people, but something had changed them. Some said it was the isolation. Others blamed the land itself, claiming it was cursed. Whatever the reason, one winter, after a particularly harsh storm, the couple was found dead in their cabin. No one knew how they died. There was no sign of foul play, no injuries, nothing. It was as if they had just stopped living. The cabin had been abandoned ever since. No one dared to go near it, and over the years, it had fallen into disrepair. The trees and underbrush had grown around it, swallowing it up like it was a part of the forest. The camp directors had tried to tear it down a few times, but every time they did, something would go wrong. A piece of equipment would break, or someone would get injured. Eventually, they gave up and let it stand as a relic of the past, a ghost from another time. The counselors at Camp Wainwright made sure to keep the kids away from it. But kids being kids, there were always a few who couldn't resist the lure of a dare. That's how Emma, Jake, and Sarah found themselves creeping through the forest one hot summer night, flashlights in hand, headed straight for the old cabin. Jake, the ringleader of their little group, was the one who had suggested it. He was always looking for a thrill, something to prove his bravery. Emma had tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. Sarah, as usual, had just gone along with whatever Jake said. Emma didn't want to be the one to back out, so she reluctantly agreed to join them. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow through the branches. They walked in silence, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but there was something about the cabin that made her uneasy. "Are we close?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Almost," Jake replied, his voice steady. Just a little further, the trees began to thin out, and soon they were standing in front of the cabin. It was even more dilapidated than Emma had imagined. The roof was caved in places, and the wooden walls were blackened with age. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The place reeked of decay. "See, nothing to be scared of," Jake said, trying to sound confident, but Emma could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. They stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something foul, like rotting meat. Emma gagged, covering her nose with her hand. "Let's just go inside and get this over with," she said, her voice muffled. Jake nodded and pushed the door open with a loud creak. The inside was worse than the outside. The floorboards were rotted through, and the furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames cracked and glass shattered. The faces in the photos were blurred and indistinct, as if time had erased their features. They stepped inside, the floor creaking ominously beneath their feet. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm to get it to stay on. The air was colder in the cabin, and she shivered despite the summer heat. "Look around," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "See if you can find anything cool." They split up, each taking a different part of the cabin. Emma walked over to the fireplace, her flashlight illuminating the crumbling stone. There was something strange about the way the light reflected off the walls. She moved closer, squinting to see better. The stones were covered in scratches, like something had clawed at them, trying to get out. "Guys, come look at this," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty room. Jake and Sarah joined her, their faces pale in the dim light. "What do you think did that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Emma replied, her heart racing. "But it doesn't look like an animal. It's too deliberate, too human." Jake swallowed hard, his bravado fading. "Maybe we should go." But before they could move, a faint whisper filled the air. It was so soft that Emma wasn't sure she had heard it at all. But then it came again, louder this time. It was a voice, low and hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Help! Me!" Emma's blood ran cold. She turned to Jake, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face as white as a sheet. "Let's get out of here." They turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sarah screamed, and Jake ran to the door, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Help! Me!" The voice came again, closer this time. Emma spun around, her flashlight darting around the room. There was no one there, but the voice was everywhere, surrounding them. The walls began to shake, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. Photographs rattled on the walls, the faces within them warping and twisting. The claw marks on the fireplace glowed a sickly green, pulsing with some unknown energy. "We have to find another way out," Jake shouted, pulling Sarah towards the back of the cabin. Emma followed, her heart pounding in her ears. They ran through the cabin, searching for an exit. The walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Help! Me! Please!" Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the dark. She could barely see where she was going, the flashlight flickering weakly in her hand. They reached the back of the cabin, but there was no door, only a boarded-up window. "We're trapped," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "No, there has to be a way out," Jake shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Emma turned back towards the front of the cabin, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of an exit. And that's when she saw it, a trapdoor hidden beneath a tattered rug. She ran over to it, ripping the rug away. "Here, I found something," she called out. Jake and Sarah rushed over, and together they pried the trapdoor open. A cold, damp breeze wafted up from the dark hole, carrying with it the stench of decay. Without a word, they climbed down into the darkness, the whispers growing fainter as they descended. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, the walls slick with moisture. They crawled through the darkness, their flashlights barely piercing the inky black. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers faded into silence. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a small chamber. The walls were lined with stone, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. In the center of the room was an old wooden coffin, its lid slightly ajar. They stood there, staring at the coffin in stunned silence. The air was thick with dread, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them from all sides. Emma's hands trembled as she reached out, gripping the edge of the coffin lid. "Emma, don't," Jake whispered, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. With a deep breath, she pushed the lid open. The stench of death filled the air, and she gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. Inside the coffin was a body, its skin pale and shrunken, its eyes hollow and lifeless. But as they stared in horror, the body began to move. Its head turned slowly, the bones cracking with the effort. The empty eye sockets fixed on Emma, and a voice, the same voice that had whispered to them, rasped from its withered lips. "Thank you for helping me escape." Emma's scream echoed through the chamber as the body lunged at her, its bony fingers wrapping around her throat. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the twisted, grinning face of the corpse, its mouth moving in a silent laugh. When the counselors found the old cabin the next morning, they discovered the trapdoor leading to the underground chamber. Inside, they found 3 bodies, their faces twisted in terror, their throats bruised and crushed as if by some immense force. And as they sealed the cabin for good, one counselor swore he heard a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Thank you for helping me escape."